Picture this moment if you can. It is December 19th, 1944, and deep inside a Belgian forest, 100,000 American soldiers sit trapped like prey in a closing snare. German tanks encircle them. Winter freezes their blood. Hope dims with each passing hour. The fastest military machine the world has ever seen, Adolf Hitler's legendary Blitzkrieg, has caught the Allies completely by surprise and now threatens to split their entire front wide open, and perhaps even change the outcome of the war itself. Military experts predict it will take weeks to move enough reinforcements to save those trapped men, but someone has to try anyway. Then something impossible happens. An army begins to move not at the speed of marching feet or even tank treads, but at the speed of screaming steel wheels on iron rails. And what unfolds next will rewrite every assumption about how fast military power can actually be deployed across a continent. Most people who study World War II can tell you about the tanks and the planes and the infantry divisions that fought across Europe, but almost nobody remembers the men who made all of that possible. They were not Marines storming beaches or paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines. They were railway men, thousands of ordinary American civilians who worked for companies like the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Southern Pacific and the New York Central, men who knew every gauge of track and every bolt in a locomotive engine, men who could read the language of steam and steel like poets read verses. When war came calling, these railway workers did something extraordinary. They put on army uniforms and brought their decades of expertise with them, creating a military force unlike anything the world had ever seen before. The United States Military Railway Service became the invisible backbone of Allied victory, and their story begins not in the chaos of war, but in the quiet planning rooms of the 1930s when forward-thinking officers realized that the next great conflict would be won or lost not just on battlefields, but on railway tracks stretching across entire continents. The Army had learned hard lessons about military railways during World War I, when hastily organized railroad units struggled to move supplies efficiently in France. After that war ended, military planners sat down with civilian railroad executives and designed something revolutionary called the affiliation program. Under this brilliant system, major American railroad companies would sponsor specific military railway battalions during peacetime. Railroad workers would train as reserve soldiers while keeping their civilian jobs, and when war came, entire units of expert railroaders could be activated instantly with all their knowledge intact. A railway operating battalion was designed to mirror exactly how civilian railroads worked, with companies dedicated to track maintenance, locomotive repair, and train operations. Each battalion could manage between 90 and 150 miles of single-track railroad, dispatching trains around the clock and keeping supplies flowing like blood through veins. The battalion commanders were not career Army officers who had studied railways in textbooks, but actual division superintendents who had spent their lives running real railroads in places like Kansas and Texas and Illinois. In June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor brought America into the war, the Army activated the very first railway operating battalion at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. The 711th Railway Operating Battalion had no civilian sponsor because it existed purely for training purposes, but it proved the concept worked beautifully. Within just 48 days, this new unit completely rehabilitated an old, neglected railroad line that served the fort, replacing thousands of rotted ties, repairing bridges, and installing culverts. Then they moved to Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, where they built something even more ambitious. Working alongside thousands of engineer troops, the 711th constructed an entirely new 50-mile railroad through difficult terrain between Camp Claiborne and Fort Polk. Soldiers called it the Crime and Punishment Railroad because it was built on such unstable ground that derailments happened constantly. But that was exactly the point. The line became a brutal training ground where new railway battalions learned to rebuild blown bridges and repair damaged track under pressure, because that was precisely what they would face in combat zones overseas. After Pearl Harbor shocked America into war in December 1941, the railway battalions multiplied rapidly. The 727th Railway Operating Battalion activated in March 1942, sponsored by the Southern Railway Company. The 713th followed in April, affiliated with the famous Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. The 730th came next, backed by the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad. Each battalion brought together hundreds of men who had spent their entire adult lives working on America's railroads. These were engineers who could coax extra speed from tired locomotives, brakemen who could couple cars in total darkness, dispatchers who could coordinate dozens of trains simultaneously in their heads, and track gangs who could repair damaged rails faster than most people could even assess the damage. They trained intensively on their sponsor company's actual operating lines, learning to function as military units while maintaining their railway skills. The Pennsylvania Railroad trained its battalion near Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Santa Fe trained its men near Clovis, New Mexico. The Southern Railway used its lines around Camp Shelby, Mississippi. By the time these units deployed overseas, they could operate military railways as efficiently as they had run civilian ones back home. The 711th Railway Operating Battalion, the pioneering unit that had built the training railroad in Louisiana, deployed first to one of the war's most crucial but least known theaters. In January 1943, they arrived in Khorramshahr, a sweltering port city on the Persian Gulf in Iran. Their mission was unlike anything American railroaders had ever attempted. The Iranian State Railway stretched hundreds of miles northward through deserts and mountains, and it served as the primary supply route for desperately needed American and British equipment being shipped to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Every ton of material that rolled north on those rails meant one more tank or truck or artillery piece that Soviet forces could use against the Germans on the Eastern Front. The 711th was designed to operate 90 to 150 miles of track, but in Iran, they ended up managing 388 miles of the most difficult railway imaginable. The 730th Battalion joined them and took responsibility for another 289 miles. These distances far exceeded doctrine, so the Army created a new provisional battalion from railroaders already in theater plus soldiers from other units who had worked on railroads before the war. The railway men in Iran worked under conditions that would have broken lesser troops. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees. Spare parts were scarce. The locomotives were old and unreliable. Local workers spoke Persian and other languages the Americans could not understand. Yet somehow these railway battalions made the impossible routine. They handled more than 4 million long tons of freight during their time operating the Iranian State Railway. They moved 16,000 Iranian troops, 14,000 Polish war refugees, 40,000 British soldiers, and 15,000 Russian prisoners of war who had been freed from German captivity. During Muslim holy days in early 1944, they even operated special passenger trains that carried 21,000 pilgrims. The Soviets, fighting desperately against the Nazi invasion, depended completely on the supplies that flowed north through that Persian corridor, and American railway men made sure those supplies never stopped rolling. The last railway troops left Iran in July 1945, their mission accomplished so well that few people back home ever learned their names. While railway battalions toiled in the heat of Iran, other units deployed to North Africa, where American and British forces were fighting to push the Germans out of the continent entirely. The 727th Battalion landed in December 1942 and immediately began operating sections of the North African railway system. The challenges there were extraordinary and completely different from anything back in the United States. The railroads used French equipment and French operating procedures. Local Arab workers assisted, but language barriers created constant confusion. Even the hand signals meant different things, and American railroaders quickly learned that their signal for go actually meant stop to French train crews. The locomotives had no seats for engineers or firemen, so American crews had to stand for hours while their trains rolled across the desert. Bombing damage was everywhere. Equipment shortages were constant, yet the railwaymen adapted and overcame every obstacle. By June 1943, the military railway service in North Africa was moving 90,000 tons of freight every single week. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, watched in amazement as these railway troops transformed a broken system. He later wrote that when Allied forces first arrived in North Africa, the railway could deliver only 900 tons of supplies daily, but Yankee energy and modern American methods of operation increased that to 3,000 tons per day. The railway battalions operated more than 1,900 miles of track at their peak, coordinating operations between British, French, and American crews while supervising Arab civilian workers. They proved beyond any doubt that American railway expertise could work miracles even in the most chaotic conditions. The 701st Railway Grand Division arrived to coordinate multiple battalions, and together they created a supply network that made the North African victory possible. Without those trains running on time and carrying mountains of ammunition, fuel, and food, the armies fighting in the desert would have starved. When Allied forces invaded Sicily in July 1943, the 727th Railway Operating Battalion went ashore just 3 days after the initial landings. Lieutenant General George Patton, commander of the American 7th Army, was absolutely stunned by what happened next. Within 4 hours of landing on hostile shores, the railway troops had organized Italian rail workers, located serviceable locomotives and cars, gotten steam up in the engines, and reconnoitered the rail lines to figure out which routes were usable. In their first 24 hours of operations, they moved 400 tons of supplies forward to the 3rd Infantry Division fighting inland. By the 3rd day, they were moving 800 tons daily. The 727th operated 1,373 miles of railway using 300 locomotives and 3,500 freight cars, and they averaged 3,400 tons of cargo every single day. Patton had never seen anything like it. An entire battalion of specialists had essentially created a functioning railroad system on enemy territory while bullets were still flying. And they did it with a speed and efficiency that made the German supply system look primitive by comparison. The invasion of mainland Italy in September 1943 brought even greater challenges. When advance parties from the 703rd Railway Grand Division reached Naples just 3 days after Allied troops captured the city, they found devastation that defied description. Years of Allied bombing combined with German demolition teams had turned the rail yards into a nightmare landscape. Charred and twisted rail cars lay scattered everywhere. Lengths of rail still attached to cross ties pointed toward the sky like bizarre sculptures. Craters pocketed the ground. Technical Sergeant Louis Russell of the 713th Battalion looked at the destruction and must have wondered if repair was even possible. But First Lieutenant R.H. Anderson, a yardmaster from Newton, Kansas, studied the damage and made a promise. He said he believed they could get a train running by Sunday, just 3 days away. Every man in the battalion went to work, even the conductors and engineers who normally would not do manual labor. They cleared debris, straightened bent rails, and patched together whatever equipment they could find. Anderson kept his promise. On Saturday, a test train consisting of one old Italian locomotive pushing 5 freight cars moved 4 miles out of the yard. 4 days after that, 6 trains were running daily, each carrying an average of 450 tons. Naples became the primary supply port for the American Fifth Army fighting its way up the Italian peninsula, and between January and September 1944, an average of 136,000 tons of freight moved out of that port by rail every month. By July, All the railway troops who had been in North Africa had transferred to Italy, and they operated 2,478 miles of track, with an average of 250 military trains operating every single day. They also maintained civilian passenger and freight service, because the Italian economy depended on those trains to survive. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, recognized that his armies could not have advanced without those railway men. He presented them with a plaque that stated their services had contributed materially to military operations, which was classic military understatement. The truth was that without those trains running constantly, the Italian campaign would have collapsed under its own logistical weight. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, created the largest and most complex military operation in human history, and it absolutely required a functioning railway system to succeed. For 2 years before D-Day, Allied bombers had systematically destroyed French railroad facilities to prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements. Rail yards were cratered moonscapes. Bridges were twisted wreckage. Locomotives and cars were burned out hulks. Just 11 days after the landings, a small team of military railway service troops arrived in the beachhead with a jeep that had been fitted with flanged wheels so it could run on tracks. They surveyed the lines from the beaches to the port of Cherbourg, assessing damage and locating any equipment that could be salvaged. On July 2nd, the 729th Railway Operating Battalion landed and took over the Cherbourg terminals. Working alongside French engine crews and civilian volunteers, these American railway men rebuilt roundhouses and shop buildings and coaxed broken locomotives back to life. Army engineers cleared the main line from Cherbourg to Carentan, and just 9 days after arriving in France, the 729th operated the first passenger train between the two cities. More battalions poured into France as the Allied armies pushed inland. The 720th Battalion arrived on July 15th and rehabilitated 62 miles of track. The 757th Railway Shop Battalion set up extensive repair facilities at Cherbourg. By the end of August, 3 more operating battalions and 2 more shop battalions had landed, and the military railway service was operating more than 1,000 miles of track. They ran 251 passenger trains carrying 29,000 troops and 991 freight trains hauling 136,000 tons of military cargo, all in a single month. As Allied armies raced across France in late summer and early autumn, the railway troops raced behind them, repairing damage and extending operations farther east with each passing week. A second Allied invasion landed in southern France on August 15th, and railway battalions from Italy deployed to Marseille to open that port and establish a southern supply line. The 713th and 727th, 2 of the most experienced battalions in the entire service, began operations there at the end of August. Unlike northern France, the southern ports had not suffered terrible damage, so trains were rolling within days. By October, the southern line was running 1,900 trains carrying 640,000 tons of freight to supply the 6th Army Group. Everything the military railway service had accomplished up to December 1944 had been impressive, but nothing had truly tested the absolute limits of how fast they could move an entire army. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate last gamble in the West. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, punching a huge bulge into American lines and trapping the 101st Airborne Division and other units in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The situation was beyond critical. If Bastogne fell, the entire Allied front might collapse. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, attended an emergency conference on December 19th where he made an impossible promise. He said he would attack north with 3 full divisions in just 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. Other generals thought he was insane. Moving an entire army 90 degrees while it was already engaged in fighting normally took weeks of planning and preparation. Patton was proposing to do it in 2 days. What nobody fully understood except Patton and his staff was that the military railway service had created a capability that had never existed before in military history. The railway battalions operating in France and Belgium and Luxembourg had, over the previous months, built up such an efficient and flexible system that they could move staggering amounts of men and equipment almost instantly to anywhere in their network. Patton's plan depended absolutely on railways moving his divisions north faster than German forces could react. The 720th, 729th, and other railway operating battalions went into emergency action. Working around the clock in brutal winter weather, they assembled hundreds of trains. They coordinated schedules across multiple rail lines. They marshaled locomotives and freight cars from every available source. They worked with barely any sleep, driven by the knowledge that American soldiers would die if those trains did not run on time. The trains rolled north in an unbroken stream, carrying infantry divisions, tank battalions, artillery regiments, and all their equipment and supplies. What would have taken those units 2 weeks to accomplish by road movement happened in less than 48 hours by rail. Patton's forces detrained, formed up, and attacked north on December 22nd, exactly when Patton had promised. The German commanders were caught completely off guard. They had planned their offensive assuming it would take the Allies weeks to move significant reinforcements, but here was an entire American army suddenly appearing on their flank in just 2 days. On December 26th, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne and lifted the siege. The German offensive collapsed shortly afterward, and the Battle of the Bulge became Germany's last failed gamble. What the military railway service accomplished during those desperate December days exceeded even the legendary speed of the German Blitzkrieg. The Germans had pioneered rapid mechanized warfare, but their logistics always moved at the slower pace of horse-drawn wagons and limited rail capacity. The Americans had created something faster and more powerful, a logistics system that could shift entire armies across hundreds of miles in less time than it took most militaries just to issue the orders. Railway battalions had taken the impossible promise of one general and made it reality through sheer expertise and relentless effort. They had moved an army faster than lightning, and in doing so, they had helped save thousands of lives and preserve the Allied advance into Germany. As 1945 began, railway operations across Europe expanded to levels that would have seemed fantastical just months earlier. More grand divisions and operating battalions continued deploying from the United States and England to the continent. The battalions that had landed in Normandy months earlier now found themselves pushing into Germany itself, following the armies they supplied. In March, the 729th Battalion, the first to arrive in France, began transporting rail and construction materials to army engineers building a bridge over the Rhine River at Wesel. On April 9th, the 720th operated the first train across that new bridge, and in the first 30 days of operations, over 273,000 tons of freight rolled east into the heart of Germany, while more than 400,000 tons and 309,000 displaced persons moved west toward safety. When victory in Europe finally came in May 1945, the military railway service had reached absolutely staggering proportions. 7 grand divisions coordinated operations across the continent. 24 railway operating battalions ran the actual trains. 7 shop battalions kept locomotives and cars operational. Military police battalions provided security. Altogether, more than 26,000 officers and enlisted men served in railway units in Western Europe alone. Between D-Day in June 1944 and VE Day in May 1945, these railway troops loaded and moved more than 18 million tons of military freight. On June 7th, just 1 month after the war ended, American railroaders were operating 1,937 locomotives, 34,588 freight cars, and 25,150 miles of track across Western Europe. No military force in history had ever created or operated a logistics network of such enormous scale and efficiency. Demobilization began almost immediately after victory, but the impact of what these railway troops had accomplished would echo through military thinking for generations. They had proven that modern war was not won solely by the combat soldiers at the front, but by the unseen specialists behind them who kept supplies flowing. They had demonstrated that civilian expertise, when properly integrated into military structures, could create capabilities far beyond what traditional military training could produce. They had shown that speed in logistics could be just as decisive as speed in combat, and sometimes more so. The last military railway service unit left Europe in February 1946, the 716th Railway Operating Battalion finally heading home after a job well done. While the largest concentration of railway troops served in Europe and North Africa, other battalions fought their own battles in distant theaters that presented unique challenges. In India and Burma, the 705th Railway Grand Division coordinated 5 railway operating battalions that operated sections of the Bengal and Assam Railway starting in January 1944. These railwaymen faced conditions that made European operations seem comfortable by comparison. The climate was brutally hot and humid. Monsoon rains turned everything into thick mud. Local infrastructure was primitive, with almost no telegraph or telephone communications and unreliable signal systems. The railway battalions installed modern American communications equipment and added 100 miles of double track to increase capacity. They even worked alongside elephants, which were sometimes used to switch rail cars when locomotives were not available, something no American railroader had ever imagined doing back home. Despite every difficulty, the railway troops in India and Burma increased the tonnage carried on the Bengal and Assam Railway by 46% in just their first 26 days of operation by implementing American efficiency methods. Between February 1944 and September 1945, they moved over 6 million tons of freight and operated more than 5,500 passenger trains. These supplies were crucial for Allied forces fighting the Japanese in Burma and for the airlift operations that carried materials over the Himalaya mountains to China. Without those trains running smoothly, the entire China-Burma-India theater would have ground to a halt. The last American railway units left India in October 1945, having transformed a colonial-era railway into a modern military logistics network. In the Philippines, railway operations began in January 1945 after American forces landed on Luzon. The Manila Railway Company's 712 miles of track were in terrible condition after years of neglect, American bombing, and Japanese destruction. A company of railway troops arrived shortly after the landings and immediately began rehabilitating what they could salvage. Army engineers rebuilt bridges while railway specialists repaired locomotives and cars. The first train ran on January 19th, covering just 30 miles, and the locomotives burned driftwood, pulpwood, and coconut hulls because coal was unavailable. American-built locomotives and freight cars began arriving in February, and by April, 2 operating battalions, the 737th and 749th, were running regular operations on the 234 miles designated as the Luzon Military Railway. By October, railway operations in the Philippines reached peak strength with 3,200 military personnel and over 6,000 civilians working together. Between June and December, they operated over 7,400 trains with more than 48,000 cars. The Army returned control to the Manila Railway Company on January 1, 1946, and the last railway troops left 3 months later. When the final accounting was done, and all the railway battalions had returned home, and the men had taken off their uniforms and gone back to civilian life, the numbers told a story that still seems impossible. The military railway service had operated and maintained more than 22,000 miles of railway across every theater where American forces fought during World War II. Approximately 43,000 soldier railroaders served in those units, most bringing years or even decades of railroad experience with them when they enlisted. They moved personnel and freight through enemy fire, across bombed-out landscapes, in extreme weather from desert heat to Arctic cold, using equipment that ranged from the most modern American diesels to ancient locomotives that burned wood. They worked alongside people who spoke dozens of different languages and followed railway operating practices completely different from American standards. They rebuilt destroyed infrastructure while combat still raged just miles away. They kept supplies flowing when everyone said it was impossible, and they did it all with a professional competence that amazed every general who depended on their services. The greatest achievement of the military railway service was not any single operation, as impressive as those were, but the fundamental transformation they brought to how modern militaries think about logistics. Before World War II, most armies treated logistics as a necessary burden, something that had to be endured but never mastered. The railway troops proved that logistics could be a decisive weapon, that moving supplies faster than the enemy could react was just as important as tactical brilliance on the battlefield. They demonstrated that civilian expertise had a vital place in military operations, and that partnerships between the private sector and armed forces could create capabilities neither could achieve alone. The affiliation program that connected American railroad companies with military railway battalions became a model for how to mobilize specialized skills during wartime, and that model influenced military planning for generations afterward. Today, in an era of air transport and computer logistics and global supply chains, it is easy to forget what those railwaymen accomplished with steam locomotives and hand-operated switches and systems that depended on human expertise rather than electronic automation. The military railway service existed for less than 4 years of intense operations, and most of the men who served in it are gone now, their stories fading into history books that fewer people read each year. The railways they operated have been rebuilt or abandoned or modernized beyond recognition. The locomotives they coaxed to life are rusting in scrapyards or displayed in museums. The battalions that bore proud railroad company names have been deactivated and disbanded. But the impact of what they did during those crucial years can never be erased. Every modern military logistics system owes a debt to those railway troops who proved that wars are won not just by heroes charging forward, but by the specialists working tirelessly behind the lines to make sure those heroes have ammunition and food and fuel. Every time a military planner calculates how quickly forces can be moved to a crisis zone, they are standing on foundations built by railway battalions in France and Italy and Burma. Every partnership between civilian industry and military forces echoes the affiliation program that made the military railway service possible. The legacy lives on in ways both visible and invisible, in doctrines and manuals and institutional knowledge passed down through generations of logistics officers who may never have heard the names of individual railway battalions, but who practice principles those battalions perfected under fire. The story of how one railroad network moved an army faster than Blitzkrieg is ultimately a story about ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things through expertise, dedication, and relentless effort. It is about railway workers from places like Pennsylvania and Illinois and California who became soldiers without ever forgetting how to be railroaders. It is about the quiet professionals who made impossible promises come true, who turned broken railways into arteries of supply, who moved armies across continents in days when everyone said it would take weeks. They did not storm beaches or pilot fighter planes or command tank divisions, but they won World War II as surely as any combat soldier, and they did it one train at a time, 1 mile of track at a time, one impossible mission at a time. Their thunder echoes still in the distance, the sound of steel wheels on iron rails, carrying supplies forward and bringing victory closer, faster than anyone thought possible, faster than lightning, faster than Blitzkrieg itself.